So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 133, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Anthemos Georgiades, who's the CEO of Zumper. So Zumper is one of the largest residential housing marketplaces that's helping make the process of renting an apartment or home easier. It's used by over 70 million renters a year and has raised over 178 million in venture capital from top investors like Kleiner Perkins. So this is a really great chat with Anthemos where we got to learn more about the founding story of Zumper, did a deep dive into it as a housing marketplace, got to learn more about how they've scaled to become a category leader, what the fundraising journey has been like, and also had a really great group Q&A. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Anthemos, welcome to the group chat. And of course, Zumper is a marketplace that many of us here have heard of and some even probably used. So it's really great to have you join us here today. I'd also like to start off by saying, huge thanks for taking the time to do so in advance. So before we really jump into Zumper as a marketplace, I think it might actually be great if you can start off by sharing a little bit more on your background, though, for those that might not know you.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for having me. So Greek name, British accent, based in the US, a bit confusing. Grew up in the UK, moved to the US for grad school and kind of stuck around ever since. I guess there's like two types of entrepreneurs. There's the entrepreneur who wanted to be a CEO or a founder from very early, and they just kind of found a problem to go solve. And then there are kind of entrepreneurs who stumbled into it that kind of had an issue as a consumer or as a kind of in a previous life, in a previous job, and wanted to solve it and kind of stumbled into being a CEO or a founder. And I was very much the second kind. So I didn't kind of go to college thinking I wanted to run a startup. I didn't go to business school thinking I wanted to run a startup. But as like a deeply frustrated renter in my 20s, I'd encountered the same problem so many times that I kind of fell into just trying to solve it and never really thought I'd end up being the CEO of like a several hundred person company and raising $180 million like 10 years later. So I was very much that kind of entrepreneur, the second kind. In terms of background, came from the business side of the world, worked at BCG, the consulting firm, did a quick stint working on like fiscal policy in the UK randomly, and then moved to the US for grad school and raised the first $1 million during my second year of my MBA. And that was that.
Yeah, that's quite the background. So thanks for sharing with us on that. A lot we're going to jump into here, but going back to the very beginning, what were like the first steps that you actually took to starting Zumper as a marketplace, and maybe even overcoming some of the initial challenges that we all face with the marketplaces, such as the kind of cold start problem.
Yeah, I think it was like kind of day zero, which was like create an MVP, like a minimal viable product of the problem we wanted to solve, and just make sure we weren't about to spend several years of our life on something delusional. So Zumper's mission is to make renting a home as easy as booking a hotel. So we didn't want to just build a search engine for rentals. We wanted to build a transaction end-to-end marketplace. So in my second year of grad school, I spent like $10,000 working with a Serbian development shop to build an MVP of like basically trying to prove in like 2012, would renters apply to apartments from their phone in an open house? Like really basic thing that 10 years on is, I guess, more obvious, but still not prevalent. And with kind of 10 grand and kind of 3 months of trialing it, we kind of showed, yeah, sure, renters, when they find an apartment they love or a house they love, they'll do anything to apply for it. And they were comfortable sharing their credit reports and et cetera, things online. So stage zero was like, prove the MVP out. And not only was that enough to be like, okay, cool, like I'm going to spend a decent part of my life building this company, but also kind of for the path I took, which was the venture path, it was the data I needed to raise the first $1 million of a seed round, which I raised during grad school, raised it from Kleiner Perkins, Andreessen, Greylock. So I had like a lot of investors put in a small check, but kind of put in $1 million total. And that was enough to get going. And then I think there was like proper stage one where we'd raised $1 million in seeds. We put a small but amazing team together. And back to your cold start question, I mean, you guys, I've listened to many of the talks. I mean, this is classic marketplace liquidity. You have zero renters, zero landlords. How do you solve the lack of any network effect? And I think this is true in most marketplaces and 1,000% true in real estate. You have to bet on supply first. So you have to solve the chicken and egg problem of why would a landlord come to Zumper or website ABC, where we have no renters, no MAUs, no visits, no page views. And so basically the kind of first 2 years was spent building tools for landlords to manage their rentals. So whether it was like pricing guidance or tenant screening or a CRM that were intrinsically valuable, but that so happened to also put their listing on this small, tiny website called Zumper that no one was using at the time. We also syndicated it out to Zillow and some other websites that had a lot of users. So it was still valuable. And so basically it's the classic marketplace game of build tools, kind of come for the tools and then ultimately stay for the marketplace. And first 2 years of the company was solving chicken and egg by betting heavily on tools for the supply side before we even had our first million MAU month.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and thanks for sharing with us on that. Yes, so also too, one of the things that a lot of marketplaces typically do is kind of constrain to a specific kind of market or geography. So is that something that you also did in the early days, or?
Yep. If you came to Zumper like back in 2012, 13, you could pick from 3 cities. It was super janky. We'd load a map and then we throw 3 bubbles on top of the map. You could either pick San Francisco, New York, or Chicago. And in all honesty, they weren't meticulously studied. This wasn't data science driven. This was purely based on where we had like better connections to supply and where we had more traction with supply. And so actually for the first 2 years, we were only in 3 cities, which is kind of embarrassing when you look back on it. We're trying to build a rental marketplace where people could be like socially mobile and move across the US. But we constrained it to 3 geographies and it's heavily supply focused too.
Yeah, so you mentioned as far as like the notice, the importance of focusing on supply and that kind of supply liquidity. So how did you think about, when the right time was, when you had enough kind of liquidity with supply to kind of move into more of I would say, on the demand side and kind of solving for demand?
Yeah, so so there's a couple of things that happened. First of all, as we built supply up in those 3 markets, as many founders find out, like through building supply in constrained geos, you often work with the enterprise or SMB kind of community on the supply side. So for us, the bigger landlords or the biggest PMCs, where only 5% of the inventory they had was in these 3 markets, 95% was outside. So when we finally switched Zumper's map on for the full US, we had a baseline supply liquidity that had been built accidentally almost by focusing on these 3 markets. The key stat for us, there's like one number that just explains how Zumper got to this stage. And now we need to hit our next stage, but it was 85%. The key number for us was when we got supply to about 85% of what we thought was the full rental supply in the market, whether that was measured against our biggest competitor in the market or by publicly available data for how many rentals were available in any given month. When Zumper got to 85% supply, we saw the flywheel kick in, where our MAUs that had started to come in through SEO or through some early word of mouth would stick and they'd return. And so it wasn't just that we brought more MAUs in, it was that our sessions per MAU started growing, meaning people were finally finding value on the platform. And so I'd say we're a 10-year-old company now. For the first 5 years, we reported every single week what our total supply number was in every single market, where the numerator was our supply and the denominator was what we estimated to be the total supply. We targeted getting to 85% in every single market. And that's when the flywheel span.
Yeah, no, this is great. I guess it might be helpful though. I realize how we didn't kind of do like an overview. To kind of take a step back and would you mind giving us kind of like an overview of where Zumper is at today?
Yeah, Zumper's an online residential rental marketplace. We're used by about 60 million people every year in the US and Canada to find, until very recently, just long-term apartments and houses for rent, classic 12-month leases. And then as of H2 last year, we've also brought short-term rentals onto Zumper. We're not really kind of trying to compete with Airbnb or Vrbo at a nightly stay. They are the dominant marketplaces there. But we do see this interesting opportunity and overlap in the more like month-to-month space of a lot of our renters who want kind of to try a couple of neighborhoods before they pick their long-term option. So Zumper's an online rental marketplace. We are 10 years old. We're a Series D company. And as I mentioned earlier, we've kind of raised venture capital to get there. We've raised 180 million to get as far as we have. And it also at the same time feels like we've barely begun. The mission of the company is to make renting a home as easy as booking a hotel. I'd say we have done a great job at stage one, which is build a very relevant like rental marketplace. We compete with, Zillow and apartments.com in the public markets as a kind of a must buy now for many of our kind of landlords and PMC clients. But as encapsulated in our kind of company mission, we want to be transactional. And we built a lot of tools that bring both renters and landlords into transactions. But we also absolutely still believe that most rentals will be 2 tap clicks to close in the future. And I think we've barely scratched the surface on delivering the end game.
Yeah, I mean, that's like quite incredible, the essence of scale that you're at today. So, huge congrats on that. So you mentioned as far as like, being transactional and kind of owning that transaction. So was that something that you did kind of since the beginning, or could you maybe, and then also describe like what that product experience is like for kind of both sides that use Zumper?
Yeah, so that kind of first MVP basically had, I think it was at the time the first ever, and it was super janky, but the first ever online application for a rental apartment, and which it's obvious now, but it was not obvious 10 years ago. And this is before native mobile. So kind of like on mobile where people on BlackBerries literally doing it in an open house. And in terms of product strategy, I guess not the irony, but the kind of tack of the ship was we raised $1 million from these like really amazing VCs, many of whom have been with us for the entire journey. And we then took the venture capital and didn't execute on that original product vision. We said, hey, the end game is to build an end-to-end platform. Our MVP showed that it will happen, but it's not valuable on its own. But just building a transaction layer wasn't that valuable. You were kind of a feature of someone else's marketplace, but you weren't a marketplace. So actually, I remember one of the most seminal kind of conversations I had with my co-founders was actually, and credit to my co-founder, Russ, who is still with us and is amazing. He said, is much more valuable as a marketplace. Now, building the marketplace is going to take a lot of time, but a transaction layer is a feature of a wider marketplace. So actually, kind of TLDR, we went back to the drawing board with $1 million and actually didn't build the transaction layer first. We spent what we thought would be a few years getting to tens of millions of annual users. Obviously, that took longer than we thought. And I think it took 3 years to get to our first month of 1 million users. So still happy with it, but it took basically 1,000 days to get to 1 million users a month. And then the next steps were easier to get to where we are now. But spent the kind of first real stage of the company building marketplace liquidity. And honestly, only in the last 2 or 3 years have we started to make strides on like the end-to-end page. So what does that look like? On long-term rentals, our core product, we built kind of the first ever tenant screening tool you could do from your iPhone and now Android. You can sign leases within Zumper. There's kind of lease customization for landlords. So we kind of take both the supply and demand side all the way through the transaction. And then as we got into short-term rentals, kind of in the last 6 months, there are obviously kind of good paradigms for renters closing a 1 or 2 month lease online, where it's pretty easy to see why they would do that and that they're comfortable doing it. So actually, the kind of headline is the transaction tools on their own weren't a big enough TAM or opportunity, but they're much more interesting when you already have the marketplace liquidity and you can kind of guide both sides of the market down into your transaction layer.
Yeah, no, that actually brings up a pretty common topic that comes up in the community, which is actually, thinking about like as a marketplace, and if you're kind of taking an end-to-end approach, how you kind of go from like that kind of core, value that you offer, thinking about like sequencing into like layering on new services or kind of, products and features, how have you kind of thought about that? And, maybe more recently, if you're kind of looking back.
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I'd love to say that the answer was, well, you just build the best product and people come, but that just isn't true. We have launched phenomenal transactional tools before the market did. When we were like a Series A company, we just didn't have distribution at the time because I think at the Series A, we weren't a must buy in our industry in terms of the core kind of baseline product that if people know Zumper, they know us mainly as a search marketplace to find a place to rent. And I think the key lesson is distribution is the cheat code. And so what I mean by that is now Zumper on our vanilla 4 product, which is advertising for landlords, for renters to find their places before they transact. Now we have distribution there with the enterprise, the SMBs, and the long tail landlords who all know who Zumper is now, and many of them use us. When we launch transaction tools, it is so much easier now to launch them to a captive audience who trust us because we deliver value to their core kind of like demands. I think 99 times out of 100, the cheat code to getting those tools adopted, especially when it's a new workflow or something that might risk, someone's job or like threaten some people, is distribution and having an existing relationship with the customer. So to come back to your question, Mike, now we've actually built a great relationship across the supply chain when we launch more innovative products, whether they're AI products or products that might reduce the need to have so many people in a building kind of working, but so you could redeploy them somewhere else. It's a much easier conversation, and I think it feels much more like a partnership than it does just like a annoying startup telling everyone that they're smarter than everyone, because it's often not the case.
Yeah, no, you got a lot of head nods when you said distribution is a cheat code from founders here. So one thing I did want to discuss a little bit too is as far as when it comes to the markets that you operate in, and kind of like what that expansion kind of playbook looks like, because I'm assuming the markets are kind of quite nuanced and regulatory kind of considerations there too.
Yeah, our two biggest markets, our only two markets in terms of national markets, are the US and Canada. Just, I guess, the interesting observation I've had is, so Zumper is a very organic driven kind of audience base. So that our monthly users and our annual users are basically 100% organic, meaning they're either coming to the brand, they come through SEO, or they're kind of re-engaged. So like building, kind of using our existing database of tens of millions of users and kind of re-engaging them when we think they're ready to rent again using data science. My interesting observation on the kind of expansion, Mike, is the US is an incredibly difficult market to build a marketplace in. No regrets, all in, absolutely love it, and I love the hardest challenge. And my data point is Canada. So we launched in Canada almost by accident when we acquired another marketplace that some people may know called PadMapper. So there's a great company called PadMapper run by Eric and Rob. They were like a YC company. They existed before Zumper wrote his first line of code. In 2016, we acquired them. They had operated in Canada, and we inherited their Canadian business and thought it was a great opportunity and built Zumper into Canada. If you do like a SEO search for like Toronto apartments or Montreal apartments, whatever, you'll see Zumper's in the top 2 or 3 results typically. In the US, as the largest kind of private player from an audience perspective, where there's us and like a couple of public companies, we're still not in the top 2 or 3 results on SEO. And so for one of our biggest distribution channels on demand and MAUs in the US, we're still fighting for relevance, and we're pretty big. In Canada, we're one of the top 2, and it happened almost overnight. They literally took about 3 months after we acquired PadMapper and integrated their listings. Zumper started ranking at the top of page 1 on Google in Canada. So I guess my geographic and scale lesson is the US is the hardest market in the world, probably, maybe China, to build a marketplace business. It is so competitive. There are so many venture-backed players. And it's not to say Canada is easy, but I would say it's 10 times easier looking at the fight we've had in both markets.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So we can all relate with the US being hard market to operate in on that. So you mentioned as far as building a brand. So how have you thought about building the Zumper brand?
So I'd say this is probably one of our biggest weaknesses. We've raised a lot of venture capital, but we've always invested it in like the product or the growth engine, and no regrets. I think that's our strength, is we are 100% organic. We are very good at kind of SEO. We're very good at like machine learning based re-engagement. And we just actually started playing with AI. We just launched our plugin on ChatGPT 4 2 weeks ago, which is really cool. However, what we have never successfully done is brand, and in particular brand marketing. And so Zumper literally has tens of millions of users every year, but our brand recognition is under 20% in the US. And so it's this weird combination of, we have real scale and distribution, but because this is quite an infrequent purchase, you're going to rent an apartment or a home every kind of 18 months to 3 years on average. We've never found brand marketing, and we have trialed it, made sense you really have to have the scale of a Zillow or a CoStar to be able to invest in the long term and kind of close your eyes to the lack of an ROI in the first 2 years. So in terms of brand, the way we built it is, I think we've got amazing word of mouth. We're very young, so we're much younger than our competitors. And I think Zumper's well known on college campuses. And the biggest hack we've done on brands is content marketing. So if you ever read about like New York rent prices are up and San Francisco's are down and Miami's are on fire, often it's Zumper data where we farm our data out to journalists and onto our blog every month. And it helps position Zumper as a leading authority on rentals without screaming about the brand all the time. But I would say brand in an infrequent marketplace is incredibly hard to pay for. You have to earn it through your product and through organic channels.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the topic of infrequent or low frequency marketplaces. That's one that we chat through quite a bit here. Yeah, and I did want to mention I have seen a lot of the reports that are out there as far as like on rent pricing and whatnot that you're doing to kind of build up that domain authority, which is really cool. So you did mention AI, right? And we couldn't go to the chat without talking about that. And I know I shared the post as far as like your plugin, so it looked really cool. Could you kind of share a little bit more about how you guys are experimenting with AI?
Yeah, we kind of thought when the APIs started opening up, and I mean, we've used AI and machine learning for years at Zumper, and so some of this stuff for many marketplace founders isn't new. So when kind of the especially the OpenAI kind of APIs became available to us, we kind of, to oversimplify, thought about it two ways. We either leverage this on platform, so on Zumper, to create a better user experience, or do we go and farm this and go fish in a different pool to say, well, ChatGPT or Bard or Anthropic are going to become new surface areas where people will start a rental search? Do we need to go meet them there? So the first one was, do we make Zumper's product better? The second one was, do we go and fish for new users to bring them to Zumper somewhere else? And for various reasons, we picked the latter. We said, we believe that ChatGPT and Bard and a few other kind of cases are going to be places where people will start their rental search. Even if they end up on Zumper, they will start there, and it's existentially important for us to go there. So what that basically baked into was we built a plugin for ChatGPT 4. It's really cool. It doesn't replace like a map list interface that's immersive like we have or Airbnb has in their segment, but it's hard to believe that like ChatGPT 4 Bard is not going to cannibalize search. And Google obviously know that, hence Bard. And I think as a marketplace founder, it's existentially important to go and meet users where they are and never assume that you have full distribution unless you're picking those next channels, of which many will fail, but 2 or 3 will not. And it reminds me a little bit of building for iOS and Android early. Like Zumper built some of the first ever like Android and iPhone apps. We even built for like the iPhone and Google Wear early on, even though we knew that the watch probably wasn't the most natural like marketplace extension, but you just have to take your swings. And I think we'll find with AI chatbots that the plugins that Zumper built will maybe one day just become almost like an XML feed that we send these chatbots, and the plugins are just a stepping stone to just sending them a sitemap. That's kind of how I can see it evolving. And consequently, as a large consumer marketplace, you just have to work with these chatbots. And actually, they're a phenomenal user experience for renters who have very specific queries. Like, hey, I want to live in Southwest San Diego, west-facing windows near a Whole Foods. Like, you can find that on Zumper through our ChatGPT 4 plugin if you look for it. And I think this is just like the beginning.
No, certainly. And it's definitely cool to see. But, I noticed when you were showing it on Twitter, you got pretty detailed in it, right? So, is this something that you're spending a lot of time, with yourself, or could you share a little bit more about, within kind of your team or, the org?
Full transparency. So we've probably got like 50 to 60 people on our product design and engineering team. So we're still pretty lean given how big our audience is. And we built our plugin with a team of like 3 or 4 people over 3 weeks. So what's amazing about the plugin is you leverage the power of OpenAI or the future plugins that we'll launch, and it's quick. What's not amazing about the plugin is you leverage the power of OpenAI and the future ones we'll build, and it's quick, meaning I don't want to say it's commoditized, but our competitors can build this quite quickly too. And so there are fast follows. I think, so yes, I spent a lot of time with it. I was just, as the CEO, I get an unfair advantage in like access to the right people at some of these companies. And so my job's to go think forward, unlock the doors, and then send my team, who are far smarter than I am in terms of building these products, into them. But yeah, I was involved with my team in the product development and testing and launching it. And my general kind of takeaway as a marketplace founder at the growth stage is, when I first, heard about AI, it was existentially terrifying. It was just like, shit, we're going to lose the front ends, and everyone's going to go to these things. I think I've reframed the way I think about it. If I'm Zumper, or I'm Kayak, or I'm Thumbtack, you know what? Actually, what's valuable about your company is still your supply. It's the piping of those listings and the way we order them and the way we refresh our feeds. And every second of every day, our rental feeds are doing very sophisticated things underneath the waterline that no one can see. If there was a startup tomorrow that launched a rental startup on AI, I think it would scare me less, because those feeds took us a decade to integrate and scale. And ultimately, if you have more inventory, you win. That was a lesson at the very beginning of Zumper, and it's a lesson now. And I think, given these LLMs are now open to everyone, I think the marketplaces at scale, for better or worse, have an enormous advantage still, because they can use exactly the same LLM on top of an inventory database that's 10 times larger than anyone else's. And so you could argue this is just going to entrench existing marketplaces if you took that opinion. Time will tell.
Yeah, no, certainly. So that's I really like the kind of way you're thinking about it. So I'll have to stop myself from going down the rabbit hole too much on it. But so you mentioned the team and the kind of the product team around 50 to 60. So what is the overall, like, what how big is the Zumper team, and what is kind of like the maybe the marketplace kind of org structure?
Yeah, it's roughly it's about 40% of the company in product design and engineering, 40% of the company is in sales and customer success, and about 20% of the company is like central functions or execs, so like kind of finance, HR, executive team. So it's we used to have kind of north of 250 people. In the last years, Zumper and basically every other growth stage company needed to march towards profitability. We're now leaner. We're closer to 150 now. So we're a significantly smaller company than we were a year ago in terms of headcount. And yet we have more revenue than we did a year ago. And so the kind of impact of kind of the reduction in capital and quantitative tightening and the rise in interest rates has hit every single growth stage founder and marketplace founder. And we're much leaner than we were a year ago. But what's kind of wild is we're faster, have more revenue, within like 2 or 3 quarters of profitability. So it feels like a very different company. Definitely some stuff drops. You can't just kind of slim down. There were some incredibly talented people that sadly aren't at Zumper anymore. So some stuff is falls through the cracks, but we traded it for speed and velocity. And so that's the kind of been the trade-off. And I think we're well positioned now, but it was kind of a tough year for, I think, every marketplace at the growth stage of the last 12 months.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that. So one of the other kind of topics I wanted to chat about a little bit here is that the fundraising journey, and you've raised was it a little bit over 180 million from some pretty incredible investors like Kleiner Perkins. So what has the fundraising journey kind of been like, and maybe even kind of going back to the earlier stages?
Yeah, so the kind of dirty secret, as every founder knows on this call, is that whenever you get your big TechCrunch or Bloomberg article about your fundraise, all your friends and family reach out, and the headline is super, super great, and Zumper raises X at Y valuation and just looks amazing, and people think you just kind of rolled out of bed one morning who don't work in tech. I think my family, for example, who do not work in tech, think I just like pick up the phone on a Monday and then on a Friday I've closed the round. And I think that the headline everyone knows is, for every yes on the fundraising journey, there's so many no's, and it's all just part of the game. You get so much great feedback in the no's. Sometimes you get terrible feedback in the no's, and it's about picking what's relevant. But for every yes I've had a multitude of no's. I don't know a single founder, I know one founder who maybe is at 50-50. This woman is, I reckon, honestly at 50-50. She runs an amazing company, and she's had as many yeses as no's. The 99% of other founders I have, they've had like 10 to 50 times more no's than they have yeses. And sometimes it's just they've raised too early, they've raised too late, their pitch deck isn't clear. It's all part of the game and you kind of refine it. So I think my headline is, from the outside, yeah, Zumper's raised 180 million. I've done that personally as the CEO, but every single fundraise, even though I always knew it would get done, has been like just an ordeal. Each one lasts, at the short end 2 months, at the long end 5 months. You've got to be all in. And I would say we've got better at telling the story, but if you're pricing your kind of company at the right stage and you're kind of talking to the right investors who are legit, who get the pick of all deals, you're gonna get no's, and it's just part of the game. So I'd say be prepared for no's. It's all part of the game. And I guess the only other thing is like there's no absolute number. In the early days, I was like, hey, for a Series A, how much revenue do I need? For a Series B, how much revenue? For a Series C? Whereas there's like some rule of thumbs, like by the B, you want to be at 5, by the C, you want to be north of 10. Like there are some rules of thumbs. Ultimately, you raise on momentum. You have to show like 6 trailing months of really good momentum, product market fit, unit economics, so that your forecasts are credible and your investors will obviously dig into them. And so I think my ultimate fundraising lesson has been, you kind of don't raise on absolutes, you raise on momentum. And I think that's been like a really good kind of lesson I've taken away from fundraising.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I'm kind of curious, which was would you say was the most challenging round to raise?
Good question. The Series C for us, and I could tell you why. So actually back to my kind of comment a couple of minutes ago. So I think there's like 2 stages of companies to pull up to 100,000 feet and actually 2 stages of CEO. There's the 0 to 10 million CEO who she takes a company from 0 to 1, gets into product market fit and gets it to 10 million in revenue. So it's like a proper company, but it's at the early stage of being a proper company. And then there's the 10 to $100 million revenue CEO who takes a real company with product market fit and hopefully good unit economics and scales it to 100 million, which is when you go public. And obviously Zumper's now on the second hand kind of journey, whereas we started in the first. And our Series C was the hardest because we were right in between the two. So our Series C was just like I was saying, I think we were trying to think now. We were well north of 10 in revenue at the time, but we were still kind of showing product market fit and we were launching new products. And I think as a CEO, I was also, just in all honesty, transitioning from being the person who did everything or tried to do everything in the 0 to 10 million frame to being more, hey, my job as a CEO of the growth company is to hire execs who are all significantly better than I am at doing their jobs and set them up for success with a clear vision and strategy. And I think that the Series C was the hardest round for a couple of reasons. The first was, not only was I the CEO in that transition period and hadn't fully made it across, but the company was still in between these 2 positions. So the investors had to make a leap of faith that we could transition into being a growth company. And secondarily, I did the Series C in 2018. For those of you who remember, like 2018 in the bull run we had was maybe one of the only bad years. It was like around that time that like there was a wobble, LinkedIn crashed like 43% one day, and there was like a kind of a rough fundraising market. So that was kind of tough for those kind of macro and micro reasons. And then I think our Series D, which we raised 2 years later in 2020, was easier because I think we were more on the journey of, as a CEO, I'd kind of grown and started to bring in a legit exec team. And I think the company could clearly show that it was well on the journey. But sometimes there's that in-betweener round that's very difficult, whether it's a C to Series A or a Series B to Series C. And those in-betweener rounds are really difficult.
Oh, that's great. So I'm actually getting some questions from my founders on this. So, don't want to take up too much time, you and I chatting through things. So we're going to jump in group Q&A here in a little bit. But, right before we do those, so you, of course, have some pretty incredible experience with Zumper. So do you have any tips maybe for earlier stage marketplace founders that might be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like 3 things come to mind. So I think thing one is like, if you build it, they won't come. Like, just because you launch a great product like on day one, I understand the humility, like it won't take off. We launched at TechCrunch Disrupt. There were 5,000 people in the audience. I think there were like 50,000 people streaming it on TechCrunch.com, like on the main page. And like our MAUs or DAUs on day one were like insane. And then like they never recovered for like, I don't think we got to that level of DAU for like several more years. So just because you get a fancy press article, we had Andreessen and Kleiner in our press release, yada, yada, there was no network effect. So it doesn't matter. It takes a while. And so I think like kind of point two is, yeah, marketplace liquidity takes a while, and it's all about compounding small wins. The way we got to that 85% of inventory I talked about earlier in each core market was like celebrating small wins, like getting inventory from 60 to 64% in a week. Like it just celebrate it takes time. There are invisible wins that really matter. And a marketplace, apart from a couple of like SEO algo updates that benefited or hurt or benefited us, that it's not a linear, you don't get that vertical leap. It's the compound and the arc of gravity. So just compound small wins, use your all hands to compound a 2% week on week growth. Compounded is a lot. Like compound those wins, and it takes time. And I think the third one for us has been like inorganic opportunities. Compound the wins, build marketplace liquidity, build the right company. But every now and again, there's like a cheat code to just get big faster. So a couple for us, one was acquiring PadMapper. We could have, the timing was right to acquire this other platform in our space that at the time had the same traffic as we did. So we doubled the night after we acquired PadMapper. Other ones were like building for new platforms and just taking a gamble. So building iPhone and Android apps, huge win. Building Apple Watch and Android Wear. We knew great platforms weren't obvious for rental apps or notifications, didn't really move the needle on traffic, but you have to take the gamble. And it's same with kind of AI and ChatGPT and Bards, like kind of opportunity for kind of a vertical leap if you pull it off. So final, so I guess to conclude is kind of like, if you build it, they won't come. It takes time in a marketplace, like years. I don't think we have marketplace liquidity for 2 or 3 years. So it took years. 2 is compound small wins, celebrate them with your team. Small wins are big wins if compounded. And the third one is look for cheats. There's always a cheat code. They may come 1 or 2 a year, sometimes 1 or 2 every couple of years. But when you see a cheat code, grab it.
Cool. So we're going to get into questions here. Hey, Olivia, do you want to come on?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing your insights. It's awesome to hear, what the last 10 years of life have been like as you've grown and scaled the company. So thanks so much for sharing the insights. I did have a question. You spoke a little bit earlier around kind of talking about those first 2 years and like building out the supply side and really focusing on tools. So I was just kind of curious, like, what did your business model look like in those 2 years? Were you making money on both sides, or did that change like as you kind of were thinking of like sequencing in new products and focusing more on like the demand side? Like, how did that business model evolve, or what did it look like?
Thanks, Olivia. When we did our Series A after the first 2 years, at the time, we were doing under $1 million in revenue at our Series A. I don't know where the market is today. I suspect like in today's market, like people would expect you to be doing $1 million. But full disclosure, Olivia, at the Series A, which was 2 years after the seed, we were still we really barely started monetizing. But going back to your question, what we built was really good supply side penetration in those first 3 cities. And so, yeah, specifically, we said, okay, we have no MAUs, so a landlord has no reason to come to Zumper to get rental traffic to their listing because they're using, Craigslist or Zillow or Trulia or HotAds at the time. So we said, okay, cool. What's their workflow? Like, what tools do they use in their day-to-day where we can assert ourselves? And as an offshoot of having their listings, we'll send them to Zumper and then, kind of send them elsewhere as well. But most importantly, we get them. So specifically, we built tools that allowed them to post listings, syndicate those listings in a one tap to all the other rental sites. So all the other rental platforms at the time, because we were so small, worked with us and didn't see us as competitive. So with one tap, we could send a listing out to Zillow and all of our now big competitors. And then we also did like a CRM, which had never been built for small landlords, where they could manage all the inbound demand. And then finally, we built a tenant screening tool. So landlords could, with a one tap, screen the tenants that came through and get their credit, criminal, and eviction reports kind of all wrapped into like a PDF. And so that product would never have worked if we hadn't been able to work with our competitors, because they would have said, hey, I love all these workflow tools, but I need my vacancy filled. So this has to go out to all the search portals. And so the kind of real cheat code, Olivia, was we basically built these tools. They put all their listings in our system because we had these tools. When they set a listing live, we put it live on Zumper immediately. We had barely any users. And then like 12 to 24 hours later, it was syndicated to our like partner sites. And for the first 6 to 12 months, that didn't mean anything. There wasn't any adoption from renters. But after a while, SEO started to kick in. And because we got the listings first, we started to get trusted. And then it kind of self-fulfilled that the MAUs started to build, and then landlords would start to come to us because we had the MAUs. But that took years. And to go full circle, we were making probably $500,000 in revenue after 2 years. But we could show that like something like a significant percent of like San Francisco or New York's listings were coming into Zumper first before they went anywhere else. And the headline of my Series A was, we've gone upstream to get supply coming to Zumper first. Now we're going to go build MAUs on top of it. And that was why our Series A investors backed us.
Amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for kind of walking me through that journey. That's cool to see how you approached it. And that kind of, you answered I was going to have a follow-up question because I think that you had mentioned something around like partnerships, but you addressed it, talking about like working with your competitors, because in the early days, we didn't really see you as a competitor. So that's cool to hear that strategy and how that works. So yeah, thank you.
They sadly don't work with us now. There's like 3-4 years in, when you get to scale, like obviously the game is up, and what really was a win-win. I do understand why like big public companies kind of can't then partner with the up and coming class. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a good way to start. And like, again, these partner sites we were generating great quality listings for them. So like it was a win-win. It was very clear what everyone was doing. Mm-hmm. And I just think there's always that high up conversation where like a small scrappy startup that can provide you with great listings is fantastic until they start taking your MAUs. And then it's a harder one to sell to your CEO that we should keep working with them. So I get it, but bummer, love those companies, but all part of the game.
Well, thanks so much.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a really great question. And yeah, Anthemos, we actually had someone ask a question in the community advance as far as like your to learn more about your initial partnership with with Facebook Marketplace. So that kind of covers it a little bit. So
yeah, I mean, yeah. So we Facebook Marketplace, I think it was like back in 2017, 18, we had like a really early intro to them from one of our board before they launched it. Oh, sorry. They launched Facebook Marketplace and then they decided to like bolster it because they didn't have enough supply with partnerships. And we were one of the only 2 partners to go live with Facebook Marketplace on the rental vertical. They picked auto and rental as their 2 marketplaces that they were going to bet on. We worked with them for like 3 or 4 years, and then they could have de-emphasized like some of the stuff on marketplaces. They focused on other things, fully understood. It was one of those things where it was like, as the CEO, Facebook are coming in, that's terrifying and an opportunity at the same time. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. It's Facebook. It's an opportunity because once you accept the fact that they're coming into your vertical, the questions, it's a prisoner's dilemma, like with you and your competitors. Do any of you decide to help them? Or do you all kind of lean out and say, nope, no one's going to help? And I think as the scrappy startup, you'll have a higher propensity to be like, well, they're coming in. We're going to benefit in at least the medium term by helping them. Let's try and benefit in the medium term, work out in the long term how we can live together. So we partnered with them. Their audience was enormous. We all know this about Facebook, even still we've all moved off to Instagram and stuff, or at least my generation has, but like, I'm 41. So like the oldies are kind of migrated to Instagram, but the scale they have was absolutely enormous. Like as big as I thought Zumper was when we opened up our Facebook Marketplace kind of relationship. And obviously I can't disclose what it was, but like, yeah, it's humbling to see what like social has. Like marketplaces are massive, but when social just flips it on, like, wow. Humblingly large volume.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It could probably be a off the record conversation itself as far as what that's actually like. So cool. So I actually have a question here from Ian posted. So he was actually asking here what are the conditions for adding new markets? So for instance, going from your first 3 cities. So he was asking like, did you wait until you got significant kind of demand to kind of open a new market, or what were the kind of conditions around that?
Straight up supply penetration. So once. We didn't open a market necessarily when we waited to get to that 85% magic number of supply side liquidity. We just couldn't open markets at 20%. It was like embarrassing and like it would be a brand impact. Can't remember exactly what the number was. Pretty when we got to like 60% market penetration, we kind of be able to open a market. But to be honest, I'm pretty making it sound more intellectual than it actually was. The real skinny is we opened the first 3 markets. By opening the first 3 markets, we got access to like hundreds of thousands of other listings from these landlords that have presences nationally. So by the time the first 3 markets were at full scale, we already had over half the rest of like the key listings in the US. And we did a bit of behind the scenes work probably for 2 or 3 quarters, but to get local supply. And we got enough where we just switched the map on. So we went from like, first it was New York and San Francisco. Then we added a third Chicago. That was phase 2. And phase 3 was just switching the map on, knowing that we probably have supply side liquidity in LA and we probably have embarrassing supply side liquidity in like East Lansing, Michigan. And we just dealt with that and hurried to go and fill those pockets where we didn't have much. And I think honestly, launching with low supply side liquidity in certain markets was like a great fire under our asses because it was embarrassing. And we probably moved faster on filling those pockets than we would have if we hadn't launched the consumer site in those markets.
Cool. So we're gonna get 2 more questions in here if we can, really quick. We're almost out of time, but hey, Angelica, do you want to come on? And then hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. Sorry. And then Martin right after.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing so many insights. One question, because as you mentioned, you also took some maybe unconventional roads in the development of additional features or additional go-to-market elements or scaling elements. And we are currently in a situation where we are going for a little bit out of the book approach and trying to sell this to our future investors. And so what I wanted to ask is any tips on how to sell unconventional business model elements or go-to-market strategy to investors?
So our most atypical way of growing was actually the M&A we did of PadMapper, this company. And funnily enough, it kind of, to your question, Angelica, was entirely married to fundraising. We went and raised money to buy PadMapper. So we said, and I'd say it's unconventional because we did M&A as a Series A company. It's pretty early. Typically you're kind of like in the hundreds or millions or billions of valuation. And we did it probably when we were valued at less than $100 million, which is like early to do M&A. So to bring your kind of questions together, we literally went to investors and raised money to do the acquisition. And we basically had a deck that was entirely about the acquisition, why it would speed us up, why it would make us really big overnight. And a combination of existing investors and future investors backed that vision that then delivered the acquisition. And as I look back on it, some of the deals we inherited in the acquisition have paid us back the acquisition price like 5 times over in terms of just straight revenue we've earned. So it kind of worked slightly in ways that we didn't expect. So I would say if there's an M&A thing you're thinking about, literally embrace it and be like, here's the cheat code. You can invest in the cheat code before the numbers spike. Like now's the time. And if it was more something like betting on AI or betting on a chatbot, I think the questions are like, could you get a minimal viable product going? I'm just making this up, by the way. I don't know what your thing is going to be, but if it was like, hey, we have a different version of the plugin that I think is really unique, could you get an MVP going so you can actually demo it to them and be like, well, hey, if you give us $2 million more, here's where I can take it. It's always easier when it's tangible, even if it's like an MVP.
That's a really good question. So, hey, Martin, do you want to come on?
Yeah, it's basically also follow on and acquisitions you guys made, Anthemos. Based on that, once you do acquire, how does that change the organization, the past organization, and how you combine both of them, let's say?
Yeah, that was our probably worst year as a company, the year after the acquisition. We've had difficult years for sure, but often they were like market related. I think the only year we did not do a good job as a company was the year after the acquisition, for all the reasons your friends, fellow founders, or boards will tell you, which is M&A is really distracting, really distracting. When we bought this company, they'd been declining on SEO. So like it was an attractive acquisition because the kind of the suffer had been priced in, and we were like, we know how to do SEO and organic traffic well. We'll kind of rebuild them. And in all honesty, Martin, it took 3 times as long to rebuild their traffic than we thought. And as we were rebuilding their traffic, our own traffic suffered because we kind of took our eye off the ball. We only had like 23 people when we acquired them, and they only had 5. So this wasn't like a crazy deal at the time, but it was very distracting to the product roadmap. So all I would say is potentially, can you ring fence any product work you need to do on the acquisition target to the acquisition team's engineers, so your CTO and your engineering team don't have to integrate it? Can they integrate themselves? That's probably the biggest thing I learned, which is like we moved way too many of our team across to integrate them. It ended up working, but it took way longer than I thought. So if you were looking at a target as part of the M&A, do you believe that their engineering team is strong enough and loyal enough to stick around and do the integration or the product development themselves versus you guys having to do it? That was probably my biggest takeaway. Otherwise, just make sure the cultural fit is good. Like, it's way more important to spend like tens of hours with the CEO than to look at a model, especially when they're super early. The models like don't mean much. It's the human fit. And if you ever have a reservation about the human fit and your gut tells you it's off, in 99% of cases, just like making a bad hire, it's off, don't do it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's going to be super helpful for founders here in the community, because M&A comes up quite a bit, especially with the earlier stages. And I can certainly relate with, as far as the mention of M&As being distracting. I've been on the other side of them a few times, so definitely relatable there. And so this is a really great chat, and we're almost out of time here, so definitely want to be conscious of that. And but really appreciate taking the time to join us here today. So it's really good to learn more about Zumper and some of your super great insights and learnings here. And I had actually one last question for you before we wrap things up. And if you could go right back to before you started Zumper, what would you tell yourself about marketplaces specifically?
They are so much harder than you think to build, and yet beautifully defensible when you get to liquidity. I had no idea how long it would take us to get to liquidity, but once you get there, the moat is big. Doesn't mean you'll succeed, but once you're at liquidity, it's really hard to imagine someone coming to completely displace your business. And I think that's my biggest takeaway.
That's a great way to wrap things up, and somewhat comforting to know that it does take time here. So last but not least, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
At Anthemos, ANTHEMOS on Twitter, or just follow at Zumper, ZUMPER, or Zumper.com. We normally tweet as we go, and especially on our like AI journey and how marketplace businesses like are threatened by AI, how they can leverage and actually like kill it with AI, and maybe like kind of leap over a couple of other kind of bigger players who aren't developing. We tweet a lot as we go, not because we know anything more than most people, but because we share as we build, and it's going to be fast.
Awesome. Well, you have a lot of new marketplace founders coming your way.